Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of just extreme, almost comforting precision.
Oh, absolutely. Like engineering.
Yeah, exactly. It's like engineering. You fall off a bike, you break your arm, they take an x-ray, and you see that jagged white line on the screen.
Right. And the doctor just points at it and says, there it is.
Yes. It's totally binary. It's either broken or not broken. It's clean. And it gives everyone in the room this very clear, actionable path forward.
We deeply, deeply crave that kind of visibility.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we want our problems to be easily categorized because, well, a categorized problem is a solvable problem. It completely soothes our anxiety.
It totally does. But then, you step out of the clinic and into the real world. You step into the world of human relationships, of community building, or leading a team.
Or just trying to serve a neighborhood.
Right. And suddenly that beautiful, precise x-ray machine is just completely shattered. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
Yeah, you can't just point to a jagged white line on a scan to explain why your community is fracturing.
No, you can't. Or why your team is suddenly disengaged. Or why a friend is pulling away. The symptoms are there for sure, but the root causes are totally invisible. So welcome to today's deep dive. Today, we are stripping away that modern reflex we all have.
And strong one.
It is incredibly strong, that impulse to constantly act, fix, intervene, and manage. Instead, we are looking at this deeply rebellious countercultural discipline of actually observing reality before we do anything. We're pulling from a framework centered on seeing before serving, specifically the discipline of observation.
And really what we are doing today is learning how to read the hidden layers of reality.
Which is so needed right now. But it is entirely countercultural, isn't it?
Oh, completely. Because we live in an ecosystem that exclusively rewards speed. I mean, think about it. We are conditioned from a very young age, and certainly in our professional lives, to just value immediate results.
Instant metrics.
Yeah. Exactly. Rapid turnarounds. If there is a problem, the person who jumps in first with, like, a whiteboard and a 10-point plan is considered the true leader.
Always the guy with the whiteboard.
Right. But this approach flips that entirely on its head. It demands what you could call a holy slowness. It requires you to literally hit the brakes.
Which feels awful sometimes.
It does. But whether you are managing a corporate department or pastoring a church, organizing a local charity, or honestly just trying to be a deeply present parent, this is about recognizing that rushing to a solution often does way more damage than the original problem.
I want you, the listener, to think about your own week. Have you ever rushed to solve a problem for someone? Maybe you had the absolute best intentions, you genuinely cared, only to realize weeks later that you completely misdiagnosed what they actually needed.
You gave him an umbrella when what they really needed was a boat.
Yes, perfect way to put it. We want to unpack exactly why that happens, and it starts with this hidden trap that trips up almost everyone with a good heart. It's called premature certainty.
And premature certainty is, it's one of the most insidious dynamics in human interaction because it doesn't feel like a mistake when you're making it.
It feels like competence, right?
Exactly. It feels like you're doing your job. It happens when we arrive at a complex situation with a good heart, a clear message, and this fully prepackaged set of assumptions about what these people need.
We already know the answer before we walk in the room.
Right. And the profound realization here is that the hardest part of leading or serving others isn't figuring out what to do. The absolute hardest part is resisting the physical, psychological urge to do something too quickly.
Which goes against every single leadership seminar ever taught. I mean, if I see a problem, my job is to fix it. Action feels productive. Intervening feels compassionate. If I just stand there observing, I literally feel like I'm failing.
And that feeling of failure is the exact mechanism that drives the mistake. Let's look at the psychology of why we rush. Uncertainty is a highly, highly uncomfortable state for the human brain.
It spikes our cortisol.
Yes. It threatens our sense of competence and identity. If you were standing in front of a struggling organization or, sitting across the table from a person in deep pain and you don't know the answer, you feel incredibly small.
You feel useless.
Completely useless. So your brain reaches for the first available solution, not necessarily because it's the right solution for them, but because taking action alleviates your own internal discomfort with the unknown.
So the intervention at its core is actually more about self-soothing my own anxiety than it is about serving the other person.
That is exactly what it is.
Man, that is a tough pill to swallow.
It is, but recognizing it is liberating. I mean, this dynamic creates a massive difference between listening to fix and listening to understand. When you are listening to fix, you aren't really in the conversation.
You're just waiting for your turn.
Right. You are listening with one hand already reaching into your toolbox. Your mind is moving 10 steps ahead of your attention. You hear a tiny fragment of a complaint, and your brain immediately pattern matches it to some previous experience.
And you start constructing the intervention while they are literally still talking.
You're just waiting for them to take a breath so you can launch your agenda. You aren't inhabiting their world at all. You're just looking for the entry point for your solution.
And the person speaking might feel heard for a brief, fleeting second, but the conversation closes prematurely because the solution arrives too soon.
You haven't truly entered their reality. You've just used their vulnerability as a bridge to execute your own predetermined plan. And when you do that, compassion without true perception can easily mutate into this really subtle form of control.
There's this incredibly vivid story from the text that perfectly illustrates this trap. It's about a pastor who inherits a declining, struggling congregation.
Oh, this is such a classic example.
And I think anyone who has ever stepped into a turnaround situation, whether it's a failing startup, a dysfunctional corporate department, or whatever, will feel this in their bones. This leader comes in and the mandate is clear. Fix it.
So he relies on his training. He moves fast.
Super fast. He reorganizes the entire ministry structure. He changes the Sunday schedule. He launches new outreach strategies. He calls constant vision meetings. He basically just gets everyone very, very busy.
He applies the classic metrics of success. Increased activity equals increased vitality, right?
Right. Except the result was absolutely zero revitalization. Beneath all that new, frantic activity, the people just remained deeply, profoundly tired.
And of course, the leaders started getting frustrated.
Naturally, he looked at their lack of momentum and diagnosed it as apathy. He assumed they just lacked vision. He labeled them as resistant to change. He thought, I am pulling the cart and they are dragging their feet.
Because when our premature solutions fail, our next instinct is usually to blame the people we are trying to help for not responding correctly to our brilliance.
Exactly. But then, out of sheer exhaustion himself, he finally stopped. He put the whiteboards away. He stopped presenting new strategic plans.
Which had to be terrifying for him.
It probably was. And instead, he spent several weeks doing nothing but visiting homes, sitting at kitchen tables, drinking terrible coffee, listening to their stories without an agenda. And as he slowed down, he began to perceive a completely different emotional frequency in the room.
He started to actually read the room.
Yeah, he started to pick up on this unspoken, heavy grief. And what he discovered completely obliterated his premature certainty.
What he found was that his initial diagnosis was entirely backwards.
Completely backwards. What he thought was stubborn resistance was actually bone-deep exhaustion. What he thought was a lack of vision or apathy was actually a massive reservoir of disappointment.
They had endured years of being unheard.
Unheard, manipulated, and let down by previous leaders. The core issue in that community wasn't a lack of programming at all. It was a profound lack of trust.
And no amount of new scheduling is going to heal broken trust. You cannot program your way out of relational trauma.
It's impossible.
Only sustained, patient presence can do that. But he couldn't see the trauma until he stopped trying to fix the schedule.
It makes me think of this image, the benevolent bulldozer.
Okay, I like that.
Imagine you are a developer and you come into a neighborhood with this gorgeous, architecturally stunning blueprint for a new community center. You genuinely, deeply want to build something magnificent for the people living there. Your motives are pure.
But you're in a bulldozer.
Exactly. Because your operating system is a bulldozer, you just drive right in and start clearing the lot. You flatten the underbrush, you tear up the soil, and in doing so, you completely destroy the delicate, complex ecosystem that was already surviving there.
You didn't stop to map the hidden root systems.
No, you didn't survey the underground streams that water the local gardens. You just saw an inefficient landscape and started digging.
The bulldozer analogy is perfect because a bulldozer is undeniably active. It's powerful. It's moving dirt. It looks exactly like progress. But it is fundamentally destructive to the existing reality if it hasn't surveyed the land first.
It assumes the land is just a blank slate.
Right, waiting for its brilliance, rather than a living organism with its own history.
But wait, let's think about the leaders listening right now who were explicitly hired to fix a bleeding department. If an organization is actively failing, like hemorrhaging money, losing people, isn't sitting around in kitchens and surveying root systems just a dereliction of duty?
That's the natural pushback.
I mean, if the ship is sinking, you don't form a committee to study the water flow, you grab a bucket. Doesn't this slowness just become an excuse for a lack of decisive leadership?
It's a vital question to address. But seeing before serving is not hesitation. It is not an excuse for laziness or indecision. It is fundamentally an act of humility.
Humility.
Yes,
Yeah.
humility is the sober admission that the initial appearance of a problem is rarely the full truth of the problem. Humility intentionally slows us down to prevent us from aggressively treating shadows while the actual lethal wound remains completely untouched.
Treating the shadow. That's exactly what the pastor was doing with the new schedules. The schedule was the shadow. The broken trust was the wound.
Exactly. A great deal of catastrophic leadership happens because we mistake human urgency for divine direction or true necessity. We react to whatever is loudest, whatever is most emotionally charged in the moment.
The squeaky wheel.
Right. But true humility refuses the intoxicating illusion of instant understanding. It forces you to acknowledge that a neighborhood you have driven through 1,000 times, or a team you have managed for 3 years, might still contain vast, complex realities you have never actually seen.
It's the doctor looking at the initial x-ray and having the discipline to say, this gives us a clue, but it doesn't show the whole picture.
Yes, exactly. Before we cut you open, we need an MRI. We need blood work. We need to talk about your lifestyle.
And in the realm of human dynamics, that deep diagnostic work simply requires time. It requires slowness. Now, if our modern, corporate, hyper-efficient instincts scream at us to rush, where do we actually find the blueprint for this kind of restraint?
Well, what's fascinating is how this framework roots the discipline of observation not in modern management theory, but in ancient wisdom.
Yeah, it looks at the biblical precedent. It argues that observation isn't just a soft skill or like a practical leadership hack. It is a profound theological posture.
The underlying argument here is that in the biblical imagination, human sight is never neutral. Perception carries immense moral weight. How you look at a person or a place really matters.
So it's not just physical vision.
Not at all. To see correctly, with patience and depth, is to honor reality as it actually exists. To see poorly, to rush to judgment, is to literally trespass against the truth.
Let's break down how this shows up in those ancient texts, starting with Moses. Because when we think of Moses, we think of the ultimate, decisive action hero of the ancient world, right?
Oh, for sure. Marching into Egypt, demanding, "Let my people go," parting seas.
But his calling doesn't start with an action plan. It starts with observation.
It starts with the burning bush. But the crucial, often overlooked detail in that narrative is the physical movement Moses makes. He is walking along, tending sheep, and he sees this strange phenomenon.
But he doesn't immediately charge at it.
No, and he doesn't run away either. The scripture specifically notes that he says, "I will turn aside and see this great sight." His entire calling and the liberation of a nation begins with an act of sanctified curiosity.
Sanctified curiosity.
Yes, he interrupts his own daily agenda to examine something deeply mysterious. Before he could ever become a deliverer, he had to be formed into a watcher. He had to make room for awe.
We want to be the hero who delivers the people, but we really don't want to be the guy standing still in the desert just watching a bush.
We don't have the patience for it.
We want the authority of Moses, but we have absolutely zero interest in the awe of Moses. We want the massive impact without the patient attentiveness.
And we see this exact same tension repeated throughout these texts. Take the story of Samuel as a boy. He hears a voice calling his name in the middle of the night.
And his immediate reaction is to jump up and run to Eli, the human priest.
Right, assuming it's a human voice giving a human command. He has to be trained over repeated instances to differentiate between the ordinary noise of his environment and an actual divine calling.
Which is so hard to do.
It's presented as the ultimate picture of spiritual maturity, the ability to interpret what you are actually hearing. Because in our daily lives, we are constantly reacting to human noise, the urgent emails, the loudest critic, the panic of the crowd, and mistaking it for the most important thing.
We let the loudest thing in the room dictate our entire strategy. Which brings us to Elijah. This is maybe the most visceral example.
Oh, I love the Elijah story.
Elijah is standing on the mountain waiting for the presence of God. And the text describes a massive wind that literally shatters the rocks. Then an earthquake, then a roaring fire. These are massive, undeniably powerful spectacles.
But the text makes a point to say that God was not in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. The presence was in the gentle whisper.
Wow.
This is perhaps the most devastating critique of how we approach influence today. We live in a culture that is utterly addicted to volume and spectacle.
If it's loud, it's important.
Exactly. We believe that if an initiative is loud, if the campaign goes viral, if the platform is massive, then it must be significant. But reality and deep truth is frequently recognized not in the spectacle, but in the quiet, patient attentiveness that can hear a whisper.
Spectacle is what gets funding. Spectacle gets engagement metrics. A shattered rock makes a great social media post. A whisper doesn't trend.
It doesn't. But if you only chase the earthquake, you miss the actual voice. Observation is the discipline of training your own nervous system to remain still long enough to notice the reality that the spectacle is actively trying to obscure.
And then the framework brings all of this ancient precedent to a head in the person of Jesus. It suggests that if the earlier narratives teach observation as a preparation for leadership, the life of Jesus reveals observation as the ultimate form of action.
He completely embodies incarnational observation.
The way Jesus interacts with the physical world, and specifically how he directs his gaze, is revolutionary. His gaze is never extractive.
No, he doesn't look at a crowd to figure out how to leverage them for a political goal. He doesn't look at people and see attendance metrics or demographic data.
When he looks out at a massive crowd, he isn't calculating his market share.
He diagnoses their true, hidden internal condition. He sees them as harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. He sees completely through the public facade.
The examples of this are endless. Think about Zacchaeus, the tax collector up in the tree. The entire crowd looks at Zacchaeus and sees a traitor, a corrupt official, a societal nuisance. They see a category.
A type of person.
Right. But Jesus looks up and sees a man who is so internally desperate for connection and recognition that he is willing to publicly humiliate himself by climbing a tree in his expensive robes just to see.
Or the story of the widow putting her 2 small coins into the temple treasure.
Oh, yeah.
The religious leaders saw a negligible, statistically relevant financial contribution. Jesus saw a human being offering her entire livelihood in an act of profound, radical trust.
The theological underpinning of this kind of intense, dignifying attention is the concept of the imago Dei, the belief that every human being bears the image of God.
And this framework argues that whenever we reduce a human being to a target audience, or a data point, or a problem to be managed, we are literally flattening their divine complexity.
We're erasing it.
Yeah. If every person you interact with bears the imprint of the divine, then every person inherently deserves far more than your hurried, reactive judgment. They deserve the dignity of your complete attention.
This brings up a wild tension when you think about the nature of Jesus in these stories. Theoretically, within Christian theology, Jesus is omniscient. He knows everything. He knows the past, the future, the internal thoughts of the people around him.
Right.
But what blew my mind in this research is the observation that Jesus never confused his omniscience with impatience. He already knew the answers, but he constantly asked questions.
The story of the blind man, Bartimaeus, perfectly illustrates this. Bartimaeus is crying out for help by the side of the road. Jesus stops and asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?"
Now, physically speaking, it is glaringly obvious what Bartimaeus needs. He's blind. He needs sight.
But Jesus doesn't just treat him like a broken machine, zap him with a healing, and keep walking.
He doesn't just play the benevolent bulldozer.
Exactly. By asking the question, he honors the man's agency. He gives Bartimaeus the profound dignity of voicing his own desire. He lets the man's internal hope become external speech. He makes relational space for him before he provides the solution.
He knows the answer, but the question is the vehicle for dignity. That is staggering. If you're leading a team or raising kids or managing a project this week, think about your daily interactions. Are you looking at the people around you to use them for a goal, to get the spreadsheet done, to get the kids out the door on time, to hit the quarterly quota, or are you looking at them to actually know them?
Are you asking questions to give them agency and dignity, or you're just rushing to apply your fix so you can move on to the next task?
And when we connect this necessity of dignifying people to the bigger picture of how communities function, it naturally forces us to confront the exact opposite behavior. It forces us to examine the incredibly subtle ways we slip into arrogance when we stop observing and start assuming.
Yes, the danger of assumptions. This is where the framework delivers a massive gut punch. Because in the realms of leadership, management, or any caring profession, arrogance almost never announces itself with a villainous monologue.
It doesn't look like malice.
No, it usually arrives wearing the very respectable clothes of competence and efficiency. Assumptions are, at their psychological core, a theology of control.
A theology of control. Explain that.
Well, every time we make an assumption about a person or a group, we are making an unspoken, arrogant claim. Reality is already known to me. And if reality is already known, I am absolved of the hard work of inquiry.
I don't have to do the work.
Right. I don't need to walk the neighborhood. I don't need to sit and listen to the struggling employee. I don't need to ask my teenager why they're acting out. I already possess the formula. I just need to apply it.
There is a specific phrase highlighted in this framework that operates as a massive, flashing red warning light for this kind of arrogance. It's the phrase, people like this.
Oh, that phrase. People like this just don't care about their community. People like this are inherently resistant to change. People like this are impossible to manage.
It is such an insidious phrase because it masquerades as hard-earned wisdom. You hear leaders say, look, I've been in this industry for 15 years. I know people like this. They just want a handout. Or millennials like this are never going to commit to the long term.
But what we are really doing with that phrasing is saving ourselves the emotional caloric expenditure of understanding individual, messy stories.
We're being lazy.
We are. And the warning here is stark. Every single time we reduce a complex human being to a stereotypical type, we become completely unavailable to grace and actual connection.
Because a demographic type doesn't have a personal history. A type doesn't carry a specific unhealed wound. A type doesn't have complex, contradictory motivations.
When you label a quiet, withdrawn teenager as simply disengaged or lazy, you completely miss the possibility that they are carrying crippling silent anxiety.
Or when you label a low-income neighborhood as apathetic because they won't attend your community meetings, you completely miss the generational history of broken promises that taught them that trusting outsiders is dangerous.
This is why Jesus constantly disrupted social categories. He refused to treat Samaritans or tax collectors or lepers as homogeneous types. He relentlessly encountered them as irreducibly unique persons.
There is another incredible story in the source material that perfectly captures the destructive arrogance of assumptions. It's about a young, highly educated minister who gets assigned to a small, rural congregation.
A hotshot minister.
Yeah, he arrives full of explosive energy. He's read all the latest church growth books. He has pristine theological language, and he is deeply eager to revitalize this sleepy church. He looks at their low Sunday attendance, their outdated programs, their lack of outward enthusiasm, and he immediately runs his diagnostic algorithm.
He concludes they lack vision and they are stubbornly resisting necessary change.
So he bypasses observation completely and moves straight to implementation. He starts rolling out the solutions, new committee structures, new strategic initiatives, constantly pushing this narrative of urgency from the pulpit.
And the harder he pushes his brilliant plans, the more the congregation quietly withdraws. The atmosphere gets colder and colder.
Until finally, an older elder in the church pulls this young minister aside and delivers a sentence that is just devastating. The elder looks at him and says, "Son, we're not refusing your leadership. We are still deciding whether you will listen to us."
Wow. That single sentence completely dismantles the illusion of premature certainty. The young leader assumed, based on his textbooks, that he was engaging in a battle against stubbornness and tradition.
He thought he was a martyr for progress.
In reality, he was standing in a room full of exhaustion and deep, unprocessed grief over previous leaders who had used them and moved on. He entered the room operating on the assumption that his initial interpretation of their behavior was sufficient. He misread the room so disastrously because it never even occurred to him that the room needed to be read.
Wait, let me pause here and advocate for the pragmatists listening. As much as I agree that individuals are infinitely complex, aren't demographic categories and generalizations absolutely necessary to understand a community or a market at scale?
Well,
I mean, if you are an urban planner designing a transit system or a CEO leading a company of 10,000 people, you literally have to use data. You use demographics. If we throw out all labels, all categories, and insist that we can only ever act after deeply knowing every single individual's personal trauma, aren't we just paralyzing ourselves?
that's a fair point.
It feels like using a map. A map is, by definition, a generalization of the landscape. It leaves out the individual blades of grass, but you need the map to navigate the forest.
That is the exact tension. And the map and the terrain is the perfect analogy to explore it. The framework doesn't advocate for willful ignorance. It doesn't say that analytical language, demographic studies, or data are evil.
Okay, good.
It explicitly states that analytical language has a vital place, but it cannot hold the first place. The map is incredibly helpful for getting your bearings, but catastrophe strikes the moment you mistake the 2D map for the actual living terrain.
Right. The map tells you there is a river intersecting the trail. That's good data. But the map cannot tell you how fast the water is moving today after the storm, or if the bridge has rotted out, or if the mud on the bank is too slick to cross. You have to put your boots on the ground to know that.
Precisely. The guiding principle here is beautifully phrased. Information must serve incarnation. Data must serve discipleship. Research must serve relationship.
I love.
The danger materializes when our analysis outruns our affection. It happens when an organization looks at a neighborhood and says, "We have successfully penetrated this demographic," as though the demographic were a military objective or a trophy on a shelf.
Or a market share to be captured?
Right. The goal of observation is never to conquer a strategic mission zone or dominate a market sector. It is to serve living, breathing people. If we allow our assumptions to turn communities primarily into territory to be won, we will inevitably start behaving like occupying settlers rather than invited servants.
Information must serve incarnation. That is the golden rule right there. So if jumping to conclusions, relying on arrogant assumptions, and treating people like abstract data points is the disease, what is the actual practical cure? How do we rewire our brains to break this habit?
This brings us to the immense power of curiosity. And the framework argues that curiosity is not just a frivolous personality quirk. In the realm of leadership, it is an actual instrument of love.
This completely shifts the paradigm of how we view curiosity. We usually think of it as a luxury or a byproduct of having extra time.
But when you are dealing with complex human dynamics, curiosity should be your first immediate response to friction. Why? Because curiosity dignifies people before it attempts to direct them. It intentionally carves out a relational space where toxic assumption would otherwise instantly take root.
There is a specific phrase the author highlights that holds immense, almost magical power in leadership and pastoral care. It is simply, "Help me understand."
Help me understand. Uttering that phrase is a profound, intentional confession of your own limitation. It acts as a circuit breaker for panic and judgment.
It totally disarms the situation.
It really does. When a manager or parent says, "Help me understand," they are actively renouncing the arrogance of their own presumption. They're looking at the other person and saying, "Your lived reality deserves more than my rapid-fire first impression."
It completely shifts the power dynamic. It honors the agency of the other person. You aren't managing them from above. You are inviting them to explain the architecture of their own reality. Let's look at the story of the youth group leader from the research.
This is a powerful one.
This guy is leading a church youth program, and he is at the end of his rope. His students seem totally infuriatingly disengaged. They show up inconsistently. When they do show up, they sit in the back, they're quiet, they stare at their phone.
And he looks at their behavior and diagnoses it as massive spiritual apathy.
Yes, he is literally standing at the front of the room preparing to deliver a harsh, corrective lecture about commitment and disrespect.
He is about to use his premature certainty as a weapon. But right before he launches into the lecture, he forces himself to pause. And instead of delivering the reprimand, he deploys curiosity. He asks them a question. Where are you guys actually spending your time during the week, and what is weighing on you the most right now?
And the floodgates opened. The answer completely shattered his entire paradigm. He discovered they weren't apathetic or rebellious in the slightest. They were actually a deeply tight-knit, highly relational group, but they were buckling under massive systemic pressure.
These teenagers were working unpredictable night shifts to help pay their parents' rent.
They were acting as primary caregivers for younger siblings, while their parents worked multiple jobs. They were quietly supporting each other through severe private family crises. Their actual youth group life was happening informally, out of necessity, in group chats and parking lots outside the church building.
Their silence in the official youth room wasn't a symptom of spiritual death. It was a symptom of intense neurological exhaustion. The church was the 1 hour a week they could sit in a chair and not be responsible for keeping their family afloat.
Curiosity literally saved that ministry from inflicting trauma. If he had given that lecture on commitment, he would have shamed kids who were already drowning in responsibility. He would have alienated them completely.
But by utilizing "Help me understand," he learned the actual truth of their terrain, and he was able to adapt his ministry to support the heavy loads they were already carrying.
It's crucial, however, to distinguish between the kinds of curiosity we employ. The framework draws a sharp line between genuine curiosity and what it calls suspicious curiosity.
Oh yes, because we have all been on the receiving end of a question that wasn't really a question. It was a trap disguised as an inquiry.
Oh, absolutely. The classic, why on earth did you do it that way?
Yeah.
Where the tone of voice completely betrays the words.
Right. Suspicious curiosity masquerades as attentiveness, but its actual function is control. It interrogates rather than listens. It is constantly seeking leverage.
You're just waiting for them to incriminate themselves.
Exactly. When you use suspicious curiosity, you are asking questions specifically to pin someone down, to expose a flaw in their logic, or to gather ammunition for your rebuttal. Your physical posture is tense, your tone is sharp.
But genuine curiosity is different.
Genuine curiosity opens up expansive space. It never corners. It is never in a rush to prove a point. It genuinely seeks to inhabit a person's actual world before ever attempting to speak into it.
And this distinction becomes a matter of life and death when we are dealing with pain and suffering. When someone is grieving or hurting, our deepest instinct is to rush in and provide a quick theological explanation or a silver lining platitude to make the pain feel contained.
We want to solve their grief because their grief makes us feel helpless and awkward.
Yes. But the framework insists that pain is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a burden to be witnessed.
A person shattered by grief does not need a strategic 5-point recovery plan. A deeply discouraged employee does not need a motivational lecture on perseverance. They need someone to sit with them and genuinely ask, what has this specific pain been like for you?
Genuine curiosity allows suffering to have a voice, to speak its truth without being nervously rushed out the back door by our discomfort.
Exactly.
So we've spent a lot of time exploring the internal posture, the why we must observe, why humility is required, why curiosity is an instrument of love. Let's pivot to the external mechanics, the what.
How we actually do this.
Right. If I am stepping into a new community, a corporate office, or a neighborhood, what am I actually looking for? How do I structure my attention? The premise here is that observation is not just walking around with a vague, pleasant awareness. It is highly structured attention. And the cardinal rule is you have to observe what people actually do, not just what they say they do.
Because human activity is far more honest than human speech. Speech is heavily filtered. People often speak from a place of aspiration, or they tell you what they think the social expectation requires.
The polite answer.
Right. If you survey a neighborhood and ask, what do you value? They will give you the socially acceptable answers. But their behavior, where they spend their time, where they spend their money, who they linger with, reveals what they actually value, what they deeply fear, and what they desperately need.
The concept here is that movement reveals meaning. People are constantly voting with their feet.
This concept completely wrecked my understanding of institutional spaces. Organizations, whether it's a church, a university, or a corporation, almost universally assume that their own official building is the absolute center of the communal universe.
The pastor assumes the sanctuary is where the real community happens. The principal assumes the classroom is the hub of influence.
But the reality is that the true social architecture of any neighborhood or community exists in the highly unofficial, unmanaged spaces.
It happens in the seams, the transitions, the places where people are waiting.
The framework highlights places like a local sari-sari store, a neighborhood basketball court, the tricycle terminal where drivers wait for fares, the chaotic school gate at 3 p.m., or even a digital WhatsApp group.
Those are the critical nodes of connection.
This is where informal authority is established. This is where the actual news of the neighborhood is shared, where reputations are ruined, where vital trust is built or broken. If a leader ignores these messy, informal spaces and only pays attention to who shows up in the boardroom or the sanctuary, they are misreading the entire structure of reality.
There is a brilliant diagnostic question the framework poses to help us read these spaces. It asks us to look at the physical environment and discern the difference between gathering and isolation. And the question that haunted me was this: is this space crowded but lonely?
Or is it quiet?
Right. And if it is quiet because it is peaceful, or is it quiet because it has been utterly abandoned?
Crowded but lonely is perhaps the defining sociological condition of our modern era. Think about a packed commuter train, a bustling university cafeteria, or the lobby of a massive organization.
Look at bodies everywhere.
These spaces are incredibly dense with human bodies, yet they can be completely devastatingly starved for actual human connection. We falsely assume that proximity equals intimacy, The mere presence of bodies guarantees absolutely nothing about the presence of community.
And conversely, a quiet street can be profoundly deceptive. Is the street quiet because the neighborhood is restful, safe, and people are relaxing indoors? Or is it quiet because of an unspoken curfew driven by gang violence and everyone is terrified to step outside? You cannot know until you observe the movement.
Let me ask the difficult structural question here. If all the real life, the deep connection, the informal authority of the community is happening outside the organization's walls, if the real action is at the tricycle terminal, the basketball court, and the group chat, does that mean the formal institution is just obsolete?
Should churches just sell their massive buildings and set up folding chairs next to the convenience store? Should corporations abandon the office and just let everyone work from coffee shops?
The framework is very nuanced here. It is absolutely not a call to burn down the institution or abandon the building. The building has a purpose. Rather, it is a call for a radical expansion of our imagination.
Expand the imagination.
A wise, observant leader doesn't view the basketball court or the break room as competition to be crushed or assimilated. They learn the specific grammar and the unspoken rhythms of those informal spaces. They recognize that life, and even the Spirit of God, is already actively working out there.
The goal isn't to aggressively drag everyone from the tricycle terminal into your formal sanctuary. The goal is to recognize that true belonging, mission, and discipleship extend infinitely beyond your four walls.
It's about having the humility to learn the native language of the neighborhood, rather than arrogantly forcing the neighborhood to learn your institutional language.
Okay, so mapping where people are is the first step, but we also have to read the emotional and spiritual temperature of those spaces. This brings us to reading the moral weather.
Just as a geographic region has a climate, every human community carries a distinct moral weather. And a mature observer learns how to read these atmospheric signs physically manifesting in the environment. And crucially, they learn to read them without instantly moralizing or judging them.
The framework breaks down 4 specific atmospheric conditions that we need to train our eyes to see: stress, joy, order, and decline.
Let's unpack the mechanisms of each of those. What does the weather of stress actually look like in a physical environment?
Well, stress is always visible in the physical environment long before it is verbalized in a meeting. It looks like hurried, jerky physical movements. It looks like a universal avoidance of eye contact on the sidewalk.
It manifests physically as a high rate of broken fixtures, shattered windows, broken door handles, litter that accumulates because no one has the margin to clean it up.
It looks like the sudden appearance of heavy security barriers. It sounds like frayed nerves, where the exact same petty conflict erupts over and over again because the underlying tension is so high.
And the crucial point is that we cannot immediately apply a moral judgment to those observations. You might walk down the street, see people aggressively avoiding eye contact and rushing past you, and your assumption might be, wow, what a cold, unfriendly, selfish neighborhood.
But the framework pushes us to ask why. Maybe they aren't cold. Maybe they are just deeply neurologically exhausted from working multiple shift jobs under crushing economic pressure. The stress is a symptom of a heavy load, not necessarily a character flaw.
Exactly. Observation requires empathy, not just data collection. Then we look for the weather of joy. And we have to be careful here, because joy is not defined as shallow, toxic optimism or a forced customer service smile.
The framework defines joy as the visible evidence of life circulating healthily within a body. It looks like genuine, unguarded laughter echoing from a porch. It looks like shared meals spilling out into the street.
It's the sound of spontaneous, unhurried conversation at the market. It's the sight of children playing safely without hypervigilant supervision. Joy is the ultimate proof that a community has not yet surrendered to the heaviness of the world.
What about order? This one really challenged my preconceptions, because usually when we talk about order in a corporate or institutional sense, we think of rigid bureaucracy, endless rules, or just keeping your desk tidy. It sounds restrictive.
It does, but the framework reframes order in a breathtaking way. It defines order as a literal form of mercy.
A form of mercy.
Think about what order actually provides. Maintain public spaces, predictable daily routines, clear and fair pathways for resolving disputes. These structures actively protect fragile human relationships from the corrosive effects of unnecessary chaos.
When a community or an organization has good, healthy order, its members don't have to squander all their limited cognitive energy just trying to survive the dysfunction.
Let's dive into the neurology of that. Decision fatigue is a very real thing. If the systems in my workplace are utterly chaotic, if I don't know who to report to, if the printer is always broken, if the schedule changes every hour, My prefrontal cortex is burning thousands of microcalories a day just navigating the chaos.
I have nothing left in the tank.
But if there is order, my brain feels safe. The routine is protective. It frees up my emotional bandwidth so I can actually engage in compassion and creativity. Order is a form of mercy. That is profound.
It is the structure within which love can operate without exhaustion. And finally, there is the weather of decline. Decline is marked by chronically neglected spaces. It's the slow, steady erosion of civic participation. It is unmanaged, aggressive noise.
It is the palpable worsening of mutual distrust. But the framework notes a truly profound, terrifying tragedy about decline. Human beings adapt to decline far faster than they recognize it.
It's the boiling frog syndrome applied to culture. What was completely unthinkable 5 years ago just becomes the new, grim normal today. And the author points out that the very first casualty in a declining culture is what they call ordinary dignity.
Ordinary dignity. It's the small, unwritten rules of grace, how people speak to the cashier, how the vulnerable are accommodated on public transit, how public parks are respected.
Once those small threads of ordinary dignity start to fray and snap, the entire fabric of the community begins to unravel.
I want you to think right now about the spaces you inhabit daily. Your office, your living room, your neighborhood block. Look closely at the weather. Are you benefiting from invisible systems of order that you've just taken for granted?
Or are there glaring signs of stress-oriented interactions, broken systems, constant miscommunication that you have just surrendered to as normal? Have you personally adapted to a slow decline in ordinary dignity without even noticing it happening?
It is a deeply sobering audit to run on your own life. And it leads us directly into a massive ethical warning. Because once you start observing the world at this intense structural, psychological level, you acquire power. And a new, very dangerous temptation arises.
Observation carries immense moral weight.
Yes, the ethics of watching well. Because paying deep attention to someone can be a profound gift, a true act of love. But if that attention twists, it becomes a violation. The framework draws a hard, bright line between two postures, shepherding and surveillance.
Let's break down the mechanics of the difference.
The difference entirely comes down to intent and the hidden power dynamic. Surveillance operates from a posture of extraction. It asks, what can I find out about this person? How can I use this information? How can I leverage their weakness to remain in control of the situation?
Surveillance literally thrives on the vulnerability of others in order to manipulate their behavior. It reduces human beings to readable, predictable objects.
Shepherding, however, operates from a posture of protection. It asks, how can I serve this person? It treats people not as objects to be managed, but as moral and spiritual mysteries to be honored. Surveillance exposes and exploits. True discernment protects and covers.
There is a highly convicting example of how surveillance disguised as care poisons leadership. It's the danger of turning people's pain into material. You see this when a leader uses a struggling family's private crisis as a compelling sermon illustration, or when a manager turns a difficult employee's mental health struggle into an anonymous case study for a leadership seminar.
Even if there is absolutely no conscious malice, human beings have a radar for this. People can intuitively sense when their messy lives are being handled as functional objects rather than being received as sacred gifts.
They absolutely can. The framework insists that privacy is not just a modern, secular legal invention. It is a profound theological reality grounded in the dignity of personhood. Just because you have the title of leader or just because you genuinely care about someone does not grant you the entitlement to aggressively inspect every dark corner of their life.
I love the story about the pastor who demonstrated incredible ethical restraint. He was observing his congregation, and he noticed that a specific member was clearly struggling. He saw the subtle changes in their physical appearance, the sudden withdrawal from their usual social circles.
Now, his immediate reflex instinct was to take this observation to his pastoral leadership team meeting so they could all, quote, pray about it intelligently.
Which, let's be honest, is very often just a highly spiritualized, disguised form of gossip.
Exactly. Hey, team, let's really lift up Jim in prayer. I think his marriage is falling apart. It sounds pious, but it's surveillance. But this pastor stopped himself. He realized that bringing his unverified observations to the committee would be exposing highly sensitive, unfinished information that this individual had not explicitly consented to share.
So instead of broadcasting it to the leadership, he went to the person privately. He listened, He protected their dignity from the spotlight, and the result of that restraint was the foundation of immense, unbreakable trust.
That is what ethical observation looks like in the real world. It consciously chooses not to weaponize knowledge. It safeguards dignity even when it has the power to expose it.
Think about the difference between a spotlight and a lantern. Surveillance is a police spotlight on a helicopter. Yes, it illuminates the dark, but it is blinding. It is interrogatory. It pins you against the wall and demands you explain yourself.
Shepherding is a handheld lantern. It casts a warm local glow. It doesn't illuminate the entire forest. It just illuminates the path directly in front of you so that you can walk alongside someone who is stumbling in the dark. It illuminates the path forward, not just their flaws.
But I have to ask the difficult boundary question. If a leader, through careful observation, sees someone making a catastrophic mistake or walking straight into danger, doesn't this principle of restraint just become a convenient excuse for enabling? At what point does honoring their privacy cross the line into negligent complicity?
It's the hardest line to walk, but the framework is clear. Restraint is not a synonym for neglect. Ethical restraint does not mean we cowardly ignore the signs of abuse, severe danger, or profound distress.
It means that when we do intervene, we respond with careful proportion and deep love. It means doing the hard, internal work of distinguishing between what information is absolutely necessary to provide care and what information is merely satisfying our own morbid curiosity. Love frequently requires intervention, but the spirit of that intervention must remain reverent. It must never be exploitative.
So, to ensure our observation remains ethical, to ensure it remains accurate and truly helpful, we have to aggressively strip away our obsession with speed. Which brings us to the final major paradigm shift. The absolute necessity of slowness, the recognition of patterns, and the lifelong cultivation of discernment. The core thesis here is that truth and patterns simply do not reveal themselves to a hurried mind.
It is a beautiful, deeply grounded conclusion to this entire discipline. The author points out that a hurried, frantic mind can certainly notice movement, it can see data points flashing by, but it cannot perceive meaning. Slowness is not a symptom of inefficiency. It is the fundamental prerequisite for true discernment. We have to return to places, to communities, to relationships again and again because human beings do not live in static states. They live in cycles. They live in seasons.
The example that brought this to life for me was the story of the Tuesday afternoon walks. A church leadership team decides they need to understand their neighborhood better, so they commit to walking the exact same route through their community every single Tuesday afternoon. On week one, their hurried minds just see random disconnected activity. They see kids running around, street vendors selling food, older men sitting under trees. It's just noise.
But because they commit to the slowness of returning, incredible patterns begin to emerge from the noise. By week 3, they notice nuance. They realize the children playing in the street completely vanish on rainy days, revealing a lack of indoor community space. They watch the food vendors slowly migrate their carts down the street, perfectly tracking the movement of the shade as the afternoon heat intensifies. They notice that the houses they previously assumed were just antisocial and closed off are actually packed with multi-generational families studying quietly for exams.
Repetition literally turns random, chaotic impressions into a highly legible, readable reality. Their brains needed the repetition to see the cycle. They finally realized the neighborhood wasn't a single, static problem to be solved. It was a living ecosystem with its own intricate rhythms. And because they forced themselves to observe slowly, they finally stopped trying to violently impose their own institutional schedule onto the community and instead learned how to naturally serve within the community's existing rhythm.
There is a profound theological point made here. God teaches through repetition. Discernment is very rarely a lightning bolt of mystical insight or a sudden flash of managerial genius. It is a slow, accumulated, cultivated habit. And a vital, non-negotiable part of cultivating that habit is a practice the author calls prayerful noticing.
Let's look at the mechanics of that. What does adding the element of prayer actually do to the psychological act of observation?
Prayer radically relocates the center of the observer. When we observe a situation purely through our own intellect, we are almost always observing from the center of our own anxieties, our own fears of failure, and our desperate need for control. We inevitably project our own psychological baggage onto the people we are watching. But prayer recenters the observer in God. It acts as an anchor. It actively prevents our attention from mutating into a desire to possess, fix, or control the outcome. It shifts the internal monologue from, how can I quickly fix this to look good, to, Lord, what are you actually showing me here?
It makes us less certain of our own brilliance and vastly more available to actual truth. Less certain, more available. That is the goal. So let's pull all these threads together. We have covered massive ground today. We started by confronting the incredibly common trap of premature certainty, the anxious desire to be the benevolent bulldozer that accidentally destroys the ecosystem it's trying to save.
We looked at the ancient biblical mandate to pause and see reality clearly before we ever open our mouths. We learned how to replace the arrogant, controlling assumptions of people like this with the dignifying power of genuine curiosity, simply asking, "Help me understand."
We talked about mapping the hidden social architecture of our communities, paying attention to the movement in informal spaces. We learned how to read the moral weather decoding, the physical signs of stress, joy, order, and the quiet tragedy of decline. We drew a hard ethical line between surveillance that exploits and shepherding that protects. And finally, we embraced the difficult countercultural practice of holy slowness, allowing repetition to let true discernment mature.
And the ultimate overriding goal of all this deep work is never to conquer a territory, master a demographic, or perfectly optimize a team. The goal is to develop the capacity to truly love real, complex people within their actual messy context.
Exactly. Now, before we end this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on this week. Throughout this entire conversation, we've used physical examples. We've talked about physical streets, church sanctuaries, kitchen tables, tricycle terminals, and basketball courts. But I want you to think about the digital spaces you inhabit every single day. Your relentless group chats, your algorithmic social media feeds, your endless grid-like virtual meetings, your company Slack channels. What is the actual moral weather of those digital rooms? Are they incredibly crowded with avatars and comments, but devastatingly lonely? Is there a slow, accepted loss of ordinary dignity happening right on your glowing screen that you have adapted to without even noticing? What would it practically look like for you to implement holy slowness in a digital ecosystem built entirely on instant reaction? What would happen if you deployed genuine curiosity before you typed your next response?
That is the frontier. Taking this deeply humanizing discipline into the exact spaces where we are most heavily conditioned by algorithms to react instantly and aggressively.
Take those questions with you into your week. Remember, the clean binary x-ray might soothe your anxiety, but human reality is beautifully, frustratingly murky. It doesn't need a bulldozer, it needs a watcher. It doesn't need a blinding spotlight, it requires a patient lantern. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the profound discipline of observation. We'll catch you next time.